My beloved child, the promise that kept you apart was never meant to last forever. Only until the truth was ready to survive. For years, your soulmate believed they had lost you because of fate, while you believed silence had stolen what was meant for your heart. But tonight, a forgotten family promise is about to be uncovered. And the people who protected it are no longer able to keep it hidden. By the time this story ends, someone will finally confess why your names were never supposed to be separated in the first place. Listen carefully. There are moments in life when people believe destiny has turned against them, when every door closes without explanation and every attempt to reach someone you love ends in silence that cannot be understood. You may think distance is created by time, misunderstanding, or simple bad luck, but sometimes distance is carefully built by people who believe they are protecting everyone from a truth that seems too dangerous to reveal. Your soulmate never knew that every unanswered message, every canceled meeting, every unexpected delay, every sudden change of plans, and every strange coincidence that pulled the two of you apart had one invisible connection hidden behind them all. Years before either of you realized how deeply your lives would become intertwined, a quiet promise was made inside an old family home where fear sat heavier than hope. No celebration followed that promise. No signatures were placed on paper. There were only trembling voices, tear-filled eyes, and one desperate agreement that everyone believed would disappear with time. Instead, that promise slowly became a chain wrapped around two innocent hearts. Your soulmate grew older believing they simply arrived too late in your life. You believed the universe had written a different ending for your story. Yet neither of you knew that every step away from each other had been gently pushed by someone who carried a burden they could never explain. Even during the happiest family gatherings, there was always one elder who became strangely uncomfortable whenever your name surfaced. Conversations suddenly ended. Smiles disappeared. Eyes quietly searched the room before anyone spoke another word. At first nobody noticed these small reactions, but over the years they became impossible to ignore. Your soulmate often wondered why every conversation about true love somehow turned into an uncomfortable silence inside the family, as though everyone shared the same secret except them. They laughed it off, convinced they were imagining things, but deep inside their heart an unanswered question refused to disappear. Why did everyone seem afraid whenever the subject somehow led back to you? Why did every opportunity to reconnect mysteriously collapse just before it could happen? Why did every path leading toward happiness suddenly become blocked by reasons that never completely made sense? Those questions followed your soulmate through birthdays, holidays, sleepless nights, and lonely mornings until they eventually stopped asking aloud, believing perhaps destiny itself had chosen against them, never realizing destiny had been interrupted by human hands rather than written by heaven. Don't skip. Far away from those unanswered questions, another heart was slowly breaking under the unbearable weight of keeping that old promise alive. The family member who had sworn never to reveal the truth believed every passing year would make the secret easier to carry, but the opposite happened. Regret quietly grew stronger than fear. Every time they saw your soulmate pretending to smile while secretly searching for something they could never explain, guilt settled deeper into their soul. They remembered that unforgettable evening many years ago when two respected elders sat across from each other inside a dimly lit room while rain tapped gently against the windows. One family carried financial ruin. The other carried a secret capable of destroying generations if it ever became public. They believed only one solution existed. A promise had to be made that no matter what happened in the future, the lives of you and your soulmate would never be allowed to cross until every consequence of the past had completely disappeared. It sounded noble at the time. It sounded protective. It sounded necessary. But nobody sitting in that room truly understood the cost of asking innocent people to pay for mistakes they never made. They believed children forget. They believed fate would simply create different futures. They believed hearts could be redirected as easily as roads on a map. They were wrong. The years proved them wrong, one painful moment after another. Somehow, despite every effort to separate your paths, your stories continued reaching toward each other like rivers refusing to flow apart. Every time your soulmate prepared to move on, something impossible happened. An unexpected dream. A familiar name. A forgotten photograph. A mysterious feeling they could never explain. It was as though the promise built walls, but destiny continued opening tiny cracks inside them. The family elder who had once defended the promise now spent countless nights staring at an old wooden box hidden behind stacks of forgotten belongings inside the attic. Locked inside rested a faded envelope tied with a worn ribbon whose color had almost disappeared with age. Across its front, written in trembling handwriting that had begun fading into the paper itself, were the chilling words that haunted every sleepless night: open only when the promise has become more dangerous than the truth. For years nobody dared touch it. But on this very day, after carrying unbearable guilt for far too long, someone quietly climbed those old attic stairs with shaking hands, believing they were only searching for forgotten family documents. They had no idea they were about to uncover the one hidden promise that had silently kept two soulmates apart for years. And once that envelope was finally opened, nothing inside that family would ever remain the same again. Don't skip. The old envelope rested on the dusty wooden table as though it had been waiting for this exact night, untouched by time yet somehow carrying the weight of every year that had passed. The family elder who had hidden it so carefully all those years ago was no longer strong enough to climb the attic stairs, and for the first time since the promise had been made, someone else's trembling hands slowly untied the faded ribbon. No one in the room spoke. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. Your soulmate's mother felt an unexplainable fear rising inside her heart before she had even unfolded the first fragile page. The handwriting was familiar, but the words were impossible to believe. It was not a letter of hatred. It was not a warning against you. Instead, it was a confession written by someone who had spent years trapped between guilt and responsibility. The first sentence froze everyone where they stood. If you are reading this, then I have failed to protect both families from the truth I buried. Forgive me, because the promise I made was never meant to destroy two innocent hearts. Her eyes widened as she continued reading. Every line peeled away another layer of deception. The letter explained that long before you and your soulmate had ever met, an incident involving both families had nearly ruined countless lives. One desperate decision had been taken to prevent revenge, public humiliation, and a chain of misunderstandings that everyone believed would continue for generations. In fear, they agreed that if destiny ever tried to unite the two families again through love, that relationship would quietly be prevented at any cost until every hidden consequence of the past had disappeared. They believed the promise would never matter because they assumed your lives would naturally move in different directions. They never imagined that despite different schools, different cities, different circles of friends, and completely different journeys, your hearts would somehow continue finding each other again and again. Every unexpected coincidence had terrified those who knew the promise. Every time your names appeared in the same conversation, someone secretly stepped in to change events before either of you realized what had happened. Invitations disappeared before reaching the right hands. Messages remained unsent. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. Opportunities dissolved hours before they could happen. Relationships that looked like ordinary bad luck had actually been carefully redirected by people convinced they were protecting everyone. But while they succeeded in delaying destiny, they never succeeded in erasing it. The letter admitted something even more heartbreaking. Every person who had helped maintain the promise had eventually regretted it. They watched your soulmate slowly lose the brightness that once filled every room. They watched you continue moving through life carrying questions that nobody answered. They saw happiness becoming quieter every year, yet pride and fear kept their mouths closed. The writer confessed that silence had become a punishment far heavier than the original secret itself. The promise no longer protected anyone. It had become the very thing destroying the peace it was created to preserve. Don't skip. Your soulmate's mother could barely continue reading as tears blurred the ink before her eyes. Every memory she had dismissed over the years suddenly returned with painful clarity. She remembered strange phone calls that ended the moment she answered. She remembered relatives insisting certain meetings should be cancelled for reasons that never made sense. She remembered one elderly family member becoming unusually nervous whenever your photograph appeared on someone's phone. At the time she believed those moments were meaningless coincidences, but now every missing piece began fitting together with terrifying precision. She reached the final page and discovered another confession, one that made her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped the letter onto the floor. Written beneath the signature were the words that nobody in the family had ever expected to read: "The promise ends not when the danger disappears, but when someone finally chooses truth over fear." If you are reading this today, then do not repeat my mistake. Find them before another year is stolen. Silence swallowed the room. No one dared speak because everyone understood the meaning behind those final words. The years that had been lost could never be returned, but the years still waiting ahead could still be changed. At that exact moment, your soulmate, completely unaware of the letter that had just rewritten the family's entire history, was sitting alone miles away, staring at an old keepsake they had never managed to throw away because something inside their heart refused to let go. They whispered your name so quietly that even they could barely hear it, never realizing that at the very same moment, inside that attic filled with forgotten memories, the invisible wall that had separated your lives for so long had finally begun to collapse. No one noticed that another small folded note slipped from inside the envelope and landed beneath the table. Hidden by shadows, it remained unopened. Unlike the confession everyone had just read, this second note contained one final truth that had never been shared with anyone. A truth capable of changing not only the future, but everything both families believed about how the promise had begun in the first place. Don't skip. No one noticed the second folded note at first because every eye in the room remained fixed on the confession that had already shattered years of carefully protected silence. The attic felt strangely different now, as though the walls themselves had been waiting for someone to finally speak the truth aloud. Your soulmate's mother sat motionless, unable to accept that so many ordinary moments from the past had actually been carefully orchestrated. Suddenly, a faint breeze slipped through the small attic window, causing the forgotten note beneath the table to slide slowly across the wooden floor until it touched the toe of her shoe. She bent down almost absent-mindedly, believing it was another blank piece of paper that had fallen from the envelope, but the instant she unfolded it, her breathing stopped. Unlike the confession, this page contained only a few carefully chosen sentences, yet every word felt heavier than everything she had read before. It began with a line no one expected. The promise was built upon a lie that only 3 people knew. Her heartbeat quickened as she continued reading. The writer admitted that the story both families had believed for years was never the complete truth. Someone had deliberately hidden one final detail because they feared that if it were ever revealed, the promise would collapse immediately. The original conflict between the families had not been caused by betrayal as everyone believed. It had been created by a single false accusation made by a jealous relative who could not bear the thought of the 2 families becoming closer. That one lie spread like wildfire, turning suspicion into resentment, resentment into separation, and separation into a promise that innocent people were forced to carry. The writer confessed they discovered the truth years later, but by then the promise had already become too powerful. Too many people had sacrificed too much to admit they had been protecting a mistake. Pride chained their mouths shut while guilt quietly consumed their hearts. They convinced themselves that revealing the truth after so many years would only create greater pain, never realizing that silence itself had become the greatest cruelty. As your soulmate's mother reached the end of the note, one final sentence left her completely speechless. The person who invented the lie left behind proof before they died. It was hidden where no one ever thought to look. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. If this was true, then the promise had never been necessary. Every tear, every lonely night, every missed opportunity, every broken conversation, and every year that you and your soulmate spent believing destiny had abandoned you had all been consequences of one person's selfish decision. The realization struck harder than any storm. For the first time, she understood that fate had not separated 2 soulmates. Human fear had. Don't skip. Determined to uncover the complete truth, she searched the old wooden chest once more, moving stacks of faded letters, worn photographs, forgotten family records, and dusty keepsakes that had not been touched for decades. Hidden beneath a loose wooden panel at the bottom of the chest, her fingers brushed against something wrapped carefully inside an old piece of cloth. She slowly lifted it into the light and discovered a small leather-bound journal whose cover had nearly fallen apart with age. Inside the front page was a handwritten message that immediately sent chills through everyone standing nearby. If this journal is ever found, let the innocent finally be free. Every page revealed events exactly as they had happened, exposing names, conversations, dates, and secret meetings that completely contradicted the version of history both families had accepted for years. There were detailed entries describing how one envious relative manipulated conversations, forged misunderstandings, and planted false evidence until trust disappeared completely. Even more heartbreaking was the final chapter of the journal, written only weeks before its owner's passing. It described endless regret, sleepless nights, and repeated attempts to confess, each one interrupted by fear that the family would never forgive them. They admitted they watched you and your soulmate grow older from a distance, secretly hoping destiny would somehow overcome the promise despite everything they had done to prevent it. Reading those words brought uncontrollable tears to everyone in the attic. No one defended the past anymore. No one tried to justify the promise. They simply stood in silence, overwhelmed by the realization that the lives of two innocent people had been reshaped by fear instead of truth. At that very same moment, completely unaware that decades of deception were finally unraveling, your soulmate found themselves unable to ignore a powerful feeling pulling them toward a place they had not visited in years. It made no logical sense, yet every step felt strangely familiar, as though an invisible force had been patiently waiting for this exact day. They did not know that while they walked toward an uncertain destination, the family had already reached one unanimous decision. The promise that once kept you apart would never be honored again. This time, they would not hide the truth. This time, they would not allow fear to choose the future. But just as everyone prepared to leave the attic, an elderly voice echoed softly from the doorway. It belonged to the only surviving witness who had been present the night the promise was made. With tears filling tired eyes, they whispered words that froze the entire room once again. Everything you've read is true. But none of you know why your names were written together years before either of you were even born. Don't skip. The elderly witness slowly stepped into the attic, leaning heavily on an old wooden cane that seemed almost as ancient as the promise itself. Their eyes moved from one stunned face to another before finally resting on the leather journal lying open across the table. A long silence filled the room, not because no one had questions, but because everyone suddenly feared the answers. After taking a slow breath, the elder whispered, "You believe the promise began because of one lie. But the lie was only the excuse. The real story started long before any of you were born." Those words sent another wave of disbelief through the room. The elder reached inside an old coat pocket and carefully unfolded a yellowed photograph whose edges had nearly disappeared with time. It showed two young families standing together beneath the very same tree where the promise had later been made. They were smiling, celebrating, laughing as though nothing in the world could ever divide them. Then the elder pointed toward two names written neatly on the back of the photograph. One was your family's surname. The other belonged to your soulmate's family. Beneath them, in faded ink that was barely visible anymore, someone had written a sentence that no one had ever noticed before: "If we are blessed with children one day, may our families always remain one." The room fell completely silent. Years before jealousy, fear, betrayal, and hidden promises poisoned their lives, both families had actually dreamed of becoming one through love rather than being separated by suspicion. The elder's voice cracked with emotion as they explained that the promise everyone fought so hard to protect had replaced an even older promise that carried hope instead of fear. When hatred entered the picture, nobody destroyed that first blessing. They simply buried it beneath layers of lies until everyone forgot it had ever existed. But paper can remain hidden only for so long. Truth has a strange way of surviving where memories fail. Suddenly, every strange coincidence from the past seemed to carry a different meaning. Every time destiny pulled you and your soulmate back toward one another, perhaps it was not creating something new at all. Perhaps it was trying to fulfill a promise that had existed before either of you took your first breath. Don't skip. As everyone struggled to absorb this revelation, another discovery quietly changed everything once again. Tucked behind the old photograph was a folded map with several locations marked in fading blue ink. At first it looked meaningless, but the elder immediately recognized the final marked place. It was an abandoned countryside chapel that neither family had visited in decades. According to the elder, that chapel had witnessed both the joyful blessing that united the families and the fearful promise that later tore them apart. Without wasting another moment, the family decided to travel there before sunset. The journey felt strangely unreal. No one spoke very much because every passing mile carried the weight of years that could never be reclaimed. Meanwhile, your soulmate woke that same morning with an overwhelming feeling they could not explain. They canceled every plan they had made for the day, ignoring repeated phone calls and messages, and found themselves driving without any destination in mind. Every turn they took felt strangely familiar, as though their heart already knew where it wanted to go long before their mind understood. They continued following that quiet instinct until the road narrowed into an old country lane surrounded by towering trees. The moment they saw the weathered stone chapel standing alone in the distance, an indescribable feeling rushed through them. They had never consciously visited the place before, yet it felt as though they had been searching for it their entire life. At almost the exact same moment, the rest of the family arrived from the opposite direction. None of them expected your soulmate to already be standing there. Their eyes met across the empty courtyard, and for several seconds nobody moved. Your soulmate immediately noticed the old envelope, the journal, and the faded photograph clutched tightly in their mother's hands. Without saying a word, they somehow understood that something enormous had changed. Their mother slowly walked forward with tears streaming down her face and placed the photograph into your soulmate's hands. The instant they turned it over and read the blessing written on the back, their knees nearly gave way beneath them. Years of confusion suddenly collided with a truth they never imagined possible. Every unanswered question finally had an answer. Every painful delay finally had a reason. But before anyone could speak another word, the old chapel bell rang by itself, echoing through the quiet valley despite no one touching it. The elder closed their eyes, almost smiling through tears, and whispered, "The first promise has finally found its voice again." Yet hidden beneath the altar, unknown to everyone gathered there, rested one final sealed box left behind by the very person who first wrote that hopeful blessing decades ago. Inside it was a message addressed not to either family, but directly to you and your soulmate, written years before your names were ever spoken together, and what it revealed would become the greatest mystery either family had ever faced. Don't skip. For several long moments, no one moved toward the altar. The bell's final echo slowly disappeared into the quiet valley, leaving behind a silence so deep that even the wind seemed unwilling to disturb it. Your soulmate continued staring at the faded blessing written on the back of the old photograph, unable to understand how two families that once prayed to become one could later spend decades ensuring that dream would never come true. Their hands trembled as countless memories rushed back with painful clarity. Every relationship that had unexpectedly ended, every conversation that had mysteriously stopped, every time they felt an invisible force pulling them away from you, every sleepless night spent wondering why their heart refused to let go despite years of separation, it all suddenly carried a completely different meaning. None of it had been random. None of it had been destiny refusing to unite two hearts. It had been ordinary people making extraordinary mistakes while believing they were protecting everyone involved. Tears rolled down your soulmate's face, not because they finally understood the truth, but because they realized how many years had been stolen by fear disguised as love. Their mother gently held their shoulder, unable to find words strong enough to apologize. Around them, every family member lowered their head in silence. Pride had disappeared. Excuses had disappeared. Only regret remained. Then the elder slowly walked toward the ancient stone altar and knelt with surprising determination. They reached beneath the cracked wooden platform exactly where the old map had indicated and carefully removed a small iron box covered in decades of dust. A rusted lock still held it shut, but beside it lay a tiny brass key wrapped inside a faded ribbon almost identical to the one tied around the first envelope. The elder whispered softly, "I prayed this day would come before I left this world." With trembling hands they placed the key into the lock. The sound it made echoed through the empty chapel like the closing of one lifetime and the beginning of another. Inside rested a neatly folded letter, an antique pocket watch that had long stopped ticking, and two simple silver rings wrapped together inside a piece of white cloth that had yellowed with age. Every person present instinctively stepped closer. Written across the front of the letter were words that immediately brought fresh tears to everyone's eyes. To the two souls our families prayed would someday meet, if love is stronger than fear, this letter belongs to you. The date beneath those words revealed something almost impossible to believe. It had been written decades before either you or your soulmate were born. Don't skip. Your soulmate carefully unfolded the fragile pages while everyone waited in breathless silence. The handwriting belonged to the oldest generation of both families, written jointly by two people who had once called each other not relatives, not neighbors, but lifelong friends. The message began with extraordinary tenderness. It spoke of hope rather than sorrow, of unity rather than division, of a future they dreamed would erase every hardship they had endured. They wrote that if future generations ever discovered this letter, they wanted them to know one simple truth: love should never inherit the fears of those who came before it. They admitted they had once promised each other that if their families were ever blessed with children and grandchildren, they would never allow pride, wealth, reputation, or old misunderstandings to stand above genuine love. They believed that promise would protect generations yet to come. But after their passing, people remembered the conflict more clearly than the blessing, until the hopeful promise disappeared beneath a newer one born from suspicion and fear. Near the end of the letter, another confession waited. It revealed that the pocket watch inside the box had stopped at the exact hour the second promise, the one that separated you and your soulmate, had been made beneath the old tree years later. The writer added one final sentence beneath it: if this watch ever returns to the hands of the two people meant to receive this letter, then let time begin again where fear once stopped it. No one in the chapel could hold back their tears any longer. Years of silence broke apart in a single afternoon. Family members who had defended the old promise now openly admitted they had protected the wrong legacy. They did not need another confession. They did not need more proof. The truth stood before them more clearly than ever. Yet just as everyone believed every secret had finally been uncovered, the elder noticed something hidden inside the lid of the iron box. Carved so faintly it could barely be seen were 8 simple words: one witness never spoke. Because they disappeared without goodbye. The elder's expression instantly changed. They slowly looked toward the chapel door, their face turning pale as though another forgotten memory had suddenly returned. In a trembling voice they whispered, "If that witness is still alive, then there is one final truth none of us have heard yet. And that truth may explain why your names were connected long before either family ever made a promise." The wind pushed the old chapel door open at that exact moment, and the sound of slow footsteps approached from outside. Someone was coming. Someone who had been missing from this story for longer than anyone had realized. Don't skip. The slow footsteps echoed through the old chapel one after another, unhurried yet impossibly heavy, until every person inside instinctively turned toward the doorway. Sunlight spilled across the worn stone floor, revealing the silhouette of an elderly stranger whose face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. No one recognized them immediately, yet something about their presence felt strangely familiar. The elder who had guided everyone to the chapel suddenly gripped the back of a wooden bench to steady themselves. Their eyes widened with disbelief before a single trembling whisper escaped their lips. "It cannot be." The stranger removed the hat with shaking hands, revealing a face deeply marked by time, regret, and countless sleepless years. Tears immediately filled the elder's eyes. "We buried your name decades ago," they said in disbelief. The stranger gave a faint, sorrowful smile before answering, "You buried my name." But not my promise. Every heartbeat inside the chapel seemed to stop. The missing witness had returned. The one person every family believed had vanished forever now stood only a few steps away, carrying a worn leather satchel tightly against their chest as though it contained the last piece of a lifetime they had protected at any cost. Without speaking another word, they walked toward the altar and carefully placed the satchel beside the iron box. "Everything you have discovered today is true," they said quietly. "But none of you know why I disappeared. Because if I had remained, the lie would have survived forever." Your soulmate stood frozen, unable to look away. Something deep inside whispered that this person had carried answers long before anyone else realized questions even existed. The stranger slowly opened the satchel and removed dozens of neatly tied letters, each one addressed to different members of both families, each one never delivered. Some were stained by rain, others by age, and a few carried faded fingerprints as though they had been read over and over by only one lonely soul. "These were meant to reach you years ago," the stranger whispered. "Every time I tried to deliver them, someone stopped me. Every time I tried to speak, another lie grew stronger. Eventually I understood that no one was ready to hear the truth. So I waited for the promise to weaken under the weight of its own guilt." Then they lifted the final bundle from the satchel. Unlike the others, it contained only 2 sealed letters bound together with a white ribbon. One carried your name. The other carried your soulmate's name. The stranger gently placed them on the altar but did not allow anyone to touch them. "These must be opened together," they said softly. "Not because they contain 2 different stories, but because together they reveal one life that was divided before it ever had the chance to begin." No one breathed. No one interrupted. Even the wind outside seemed to pause as though the entire world was waiting for those 2 letters to finally fulfill the purpose for which they had been written. "Don't skip." The stranger then turned toward the stained glass window where fading evening light painted gentle colors across the ancient stone walls. For several moments they remained silent before speaking again, their voice carrying both sorrow and peace. "Many years ago, before jealousy poisoned these families, your grandparents shared a dream that only 4 people ever knew. They believed one day 2 children from their future generations would rebuild everything that hatred had destroyed. They did not know your names. They did not know when you would be born. They simply believed that one day love would return where fear had once entered." The chapel fell completely silent as those words settled into every heart. The stranger continued, "When the false accusation divided everyone, some chose revenge. Others chose silence. I chose to protect the original blessing until the day both of you were strong enough to carry it without repeating our mistakes. That is why I disappeared. If I had stayed, the people protecting the lie would have destroyed every piece of evidence I carried." Slowly, they unfolded one final document hidden inside the lining of the satchel. It was older than everything else, its paper so fragile it seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. Across the bottom appeared the signatures of the founders of both families, followed by a sentence that made everyone break into tears once again. if future generations ever stand where we once stood, remind them that promises made from fear must never be stronger than promises made from love. Your soulmate could no longer hold back their emotions. They sank onto one of the old wooden benches, clutching the photograph, the journal, and the blessing as tears streamed endlessly down their face. For the first time in years, they no longer blamed destiny. They no longer blamed you. They no longer blamed themselves. They finally understood that love had never abandoned them. It had simply been waiting for truth to become stronger than fear. The family gathered together in complete silence, no longer divided into two sides, but united by the painful realization that every generation had paid the price for one forgotten lie. Yet just as the stranger reached for the two sealed letters addressed to you and your soulmate, the old pocket watch resting inside the iron box suddenly made a single loud tick. Everyone turned toward it in shock. The watch had been motionless for decades. Yet its hands had begun moving again on their own. Beneath the watch, hidden until that very instant, a tiny compartment quietly opened, revealing a small ivory key engraved with 7 mysterious words. The last door opens only when both hearts arrive. The stranger stared at the key in stunned silence before whispering, "I thought this part of the story had been lost forever. But it seems the greatest secret has not been revealed yet."